In 1506, war clouds were gathering over Italy. The Vatican and Florence were locked in a battle over an artist. This was no ordinary artist, but a tempestuous genius by the name of Michaelangelo. The epic struggle that followed would result in one of the most extraordinary works of art the world would ever see. One worthy of a man who saw himself as no less than God's own artist. By the age of 30, Michelangelo had a reputation as one of the most brilliant artists alive, and one of the most difficult. He had made his name with a sublime sculpture of the Virgin Mary and Christ, the Pietà, and with his giant statue of David, which was to become the most famous statue in the world. But he wanted more than just fame in his own lifetime. He wanted it for eternity. Michelangelo created his own legend, the story of a divinely inspired, impoverished artist. In old age, he told his biographer, Ascanio Condivi,
"I've always lived like a poor man, eating sparingly, drinking almost nothing, and sleeping little. I have devoted myself to the beautiful ideas which spring from a divine spirit."
In this film, we search for the truth behind Michelangelo's story. Modern artists will put his genius to the test by trying to recreate the most famous scene from one of the artistic wonders of the world, his painting of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And we will reveal just how far Michelangelo was willing to go to become the greatest and the richest artist in history. Michelangelo's troubles had begun in 1505, when Pope Julius II offered him the opportunity of a lifetime to sculpt his tomb. Michelangelo had planned an enormous marble edifice covered with 40 statues. But then suddenly the Pope had cancelled the commission. Michelangelo stormed out of the Vatican with 5 papal henchmen in pursuit. The artist had a guilty secret. He'd already embezzled most of the money the Pope had paid in advance for the tomb and bought himself a farm.
Stop! Now listen, we're on Florentine territory, so you can't touch me and you know it. Now you go back to Rome and you tell your Pope that if he wants me back, he pays me for the tomb and we make the tomb, right? Now get out of my way!
Michelangelo returned safely to his hometown, Florence. The Pope was determined to make the government there send him back.
Michelangelo, the sculptor, who left us without reason and in a fit of petulance, is afraid, we are told, of returning. Though we are not angry with him, knowing the moods of such men of genius. In order that we may lay aside all anxiety, we rely upon your loyalty to convince him that when he returns, he shall be unharmed.
Julius II was the only equal that Michelangelo had in his lifetime, I think, in many respects. This monster prince, a battling fellow, an extremely tough fellow indeed.
It was rather unusual for a pope to actually get on a horse and lead his armies into battle, but apparently this is exactly what was Julius's character, and he was known as the warrior pope because he literally went out to reconquer the papal lands for the papacy and reestablish the authority of the pope in a very physical and important way.
The government in Florence was desperate to avert war with the Vatican. They pleaded with Michelangelo to go back to work for the Pope. Back in Rome, the Pope offered Michelangelo a job. Not the job he wanted, sculpting the tomb, but painting a ceiling. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the very heart of Christendom. 20 meters off the ground, it was the size of a football pitch. Michelangelo was beside himself with rage. He blamed his enemy, the Pope's architect Bramante.
It was Bramante. As always, Bramante. He convinced the Pope that I should paint the vault of the Sistine Chapel. It's purely malicious.
He was bamboozled into doing it largely by Bramante, by suggesting that he painted the Sistine ceiling, and by painting the Sistine ceiling, he was going to make a muck of it. And he was going to fall from grace from the Pope, and that would be the end of it.
He thought I couldn't paint. He thought that my work would be inferior to that of his charming protégé, Raphael. He wanted me to fail. He wanted to shame me.
I think he had rivalries with practically every one of his contemporaries. But I think this is a naturally A-type character that we're seeing in Michelangelo, that he was naturally rivalrous and essentially dismissive of anybody else who didn't achieve the same level of accomplishment that he himself did.
Michelangelo, the perfectionist, was afraid he would not be able to meet his own high standards when he painted the ceiling. He was convinced he was not the man for the job. He was a sculptor.
I'm constantly worn out. Haven't even got room to sleep.
I am not a painter. Painting is for women and mediocrities like Raphael. But sculpture and painting are as different from each other as the sun is from the moon. I long to touch marble again, to feel the weight of a chisel in my hand. If I walk away again, there's no chance I will escape the wrath of His Holiness.
His Holiness. He'll have me killed first and offer me penitence afterwards.
As he began painting, he fully understood how ill-equipped he was to the undertaking. He sent for assistance from Florence. He wrote to friends asking to be reminded of some of the techniques of fresco painting. It is a simply unbelievable challenge.
Michelangelo despaired at the task ahead. As a teenage apprentice in an artist's workshop, he had been trained in fresco. But that was 20 years ago, and he hadn't done any since. He knew fresco was the toughest of all arts. It required painting quickly onto damp plaster. Painting the ceiling was to become the greatest odyssey in the history of art. Now, 500 years later, artist Leo Stevenson is about to follow in Michelangelo's footsteps. Like Michelangelo, he has done virtually no fresco. But working with him is Fleur Kelly, an experienced fresco artist. They've come to St. Joseph's Church in East London to meet Father Dennis Hall. Here they'll attempt to paint the iconic scene from the Sistine Chapel, where God creates Adam.
But this is a fabulous image. It's so famous, it's almost invisible. I mean, those hands, you know, it's just absolutely extraordinary because that's like the smile on the Mona Lisa. That's the most famous bit of the whole work.
Within the cliché is, in fact, the most wonderful, wonderful painting.
Mm-hmm. It has such a powerful meaning for the whole world, and to actually have it in the context of this church with the other paintings that we have is going to be a tremendous source of, I think, spiritual strength for people.
St. Joseph's is a busy East End church. Masses will continue throughout the painting of the ceiling. An inventive scaffolding design is needed to allow the artist to work without disturbing the congregation. This is the same problem Michelangelo encountered. He too needed specialist scaffolding at the Sistine Chapel in 1508. The job of designing it fell initially to his rival, Bramante.
The Vatican architect, Bramante, came up with this ingenious scheme of drilling holes in the vault from which he'd suspend ropes to hold the scaffolding. So I said to him, Bramante, that is a brilliant idea. You are a genius. Just one question. What happens when we take scaffolding down? No? Great big holes in the painting. Oh, don't worry about that, he said. We'll sort that out later. Perhaps he thinks I'm going to sprout wings or something, I don't know.
It was Michelangelo himself who came up with the solution. His ingenious idea was to brace the scaffolding between the walls. Leo consults engineer Nick McLean about doing the same at St. Joseph's.
There's an amazing sketch by Michelangelo that he did where it shows him in a kind of a stepped sort of structure, and we can't have any supports directly underneath us because that's not what he did. Now, what I want you to do is to work out a design based on that. That's not going to break my neck because I'm very scared of heights. Sounds silly, but...
no, it's not silly. He would have started by saying, OK, there is the shape. It's curving. I need to be a certain distance from that. Yeah. And so the steps that he has drawn here are natural follow-on from that requirement. Yeah. And then we know that we cannot have supports down to the ground because this thing is going to be in place a very long time and the church has to function. And it leads automatically to our truss design and, in engineering terms, leads naturally to the shape.
And it's all going to be very strong.
It's all going to be very strong, and it's also going to be quite stiff, so that as you're trying to make your delicate little paintbrush strokes, it doesn't keep swaying underneath you.
I feel Michelangelo's abilities as an engineer have altogether been underestimated. He was the doer. Leonardo da Vinci was the ingenious thinker, imaginer, but Michelangelo was a person who actually accomplished and carried them out. And the scaffolding is just one indication of Michelangelo's true interest in engineering problems and his ability to solve them in the most logical and practical way.
1, 2, 3.
It's pretty solid to me.
The time has arrived for Leo and Fleur to see the scaffolding for the first time.
Oh, wow. Look at that.
Well done.
Extraordinary.
Now they can begin the daunting task of painting the fresco. They will use the same techniques and materials as Michelangelo, and will work at the same rate. This gives them only a week to complete the scene.
It was a huge undertaking. Ordering and mixing the paints, slaking the lime, preparing the plaster, deciding on the content of the paintings, executing the drawings, transferring the drawings to the ceiling. Huge. And I did it all myself.
It's impossible that Michelangelo painted the Sistine alone. Fresco is an enormously complicated endeavor. It requires sort of entrepreneurial skills of organization. One needs to mix plaster, one needs to construct scaffolding, mix paints. So Michelangelo probably had as many as 13 assistants over the course of 4 years.
Michelangelo painted the ceiling with a technique known as buon fresco. This means applying the color or pigment to a fine layer of damp plaster. Before he could do this, the ceiling had to be prepared with several base coats of coarse plaster. This is the first job at St. Joseph's.
This is the basis of all fresco painting. This stuff is quicklime, or calcium oxide, and it's from this that we make most of the materials we need for the painting. If I add water to it, there's a very hungry reaction. This chemical wants the water inside it. And when it gets the water, what happens is it hydrates, and that gives you the basic lime putty. Of course, this would have been done on a really industrial scale in Michelangelo's day. What would have happened now is that stuff would have been left for perhaps 5 years, maybe even 10 years for really good stuff. The longer it's left, the better, because it really turns into a lovely creamy, rich consistency. You can't use it fresh. So what we have here is stuff that's already aged, and this is gorgeous.
Michelangelo's mission was to come up with a design big enough and bold enough to bring to life this huge expanse of plaster. The Pope had set his heart on something from the New Testament.
The Pope's design for the ceiling was poor. There were swirls and swirls of geometric squares and circles, and 12 separate panels, the 12 apostles. There was no drama, no scope to study the human form. I've kept the Pope's drawings. They're in here somewhere. Can't find anything. My eyes, you see. I paid for the Sistine ceiling with my eyes.
Michelangelo defied the Pope. Instead of the New Testament, he turned to the Old Testament for inspiration. He began by making sketches. Leo is drawing Michelangelo's Adam to prepare for painting the fresco at St. Joseph's.
Michelangelo wants to create somebody like the first human being, the first one ever. And so it's an ideal perfection, to sort of a extreme masculinity is basically what's on his mind. What Michelangelo would have done is do a drawing on this scale, grid it all up, and then proportionately make a large grid of squares on a bigger sheet of paper. So having done the master drawing, the next step is to get a gigantic piece of paper and to draw Adam the size he will be on the ceiling. Now the next stage after that is to prick and pounce. This is a little bodkin, a little sharp point. What I'm doing here is I'm just pricking through lots of little holes in the outline of Adam. I have a feeling that Michelangelo would have actually had an assistant do this because it's very laborious.
A fine top coat of plaster is applied to the ceiling. Just enough for one day's painting. It's known as a giornata.
So this is the basic plan. These show the giornate, which is the day work that I'm going to complete.
Michelangelo split the scene up into 14 of these giornate. With Leo painting Adam and Fleur painting God, they will each have 7 working days. While it is still damp, the artists can transfer their drawings onto the plaster.
And we'll put this on the ceiling and then pounce through a little bit of charcoal and make little marks all the way along, leaving the outline, take the paper away, and then join up the dots. Just a tiny bit more there. Taste it, can you?
Like Michelangelo, Leo and Fleur must choose their pigments carefully. If they get it wrong, it could spell disaster.
I've sent some money to my father to buy an ounce of azurite. I told him to buy the best there is. If you can't get the best, don't bother.
Michelangelo demanded the finest quality and value for money. Some earth pigments, like terra verde and raw umber, were very cheap because they were dug up in Italy. But others, like ultramarine blue, were as expensive as gold. It was imported from faraway Afghanistan.
The essence of fresco painting is very, very simple. Just the raw powdered pigment, bit of water. And unlike oil painting, where the oil holds the pigment together, and this, it's a surface you paint on, the plaster itself that becomes the binder.
I've marked out the Giornate, which is the work that I can do in a day.
And into that, you're going to do your magic on your side, and I'll do mine on mine. And the last one to finish is a sissy.
I'll accept being a sissy. I'm a perfectionist.
Fresco painting is a race against the clock. The hot weather means the artists have just a few hours before the plaster becomes too dry to paint. They must work at speed and get everything right first time, every time. But it's difficult to get a sense of perspective working so close to the ceiling, as Leo discovers.
This just doesn't look like anything. It just looks like a great big pink blancmange.
Despite working night and day, Michelangelo struggled to meet the challenge. In the winter of 1508, his lack of experience started to show as he worked on his first scene, the flood. Mildew began appearing all over the painting. Michelangelo's worst fears were realized. He had applied the plaster too wet. He had to destroy his work and start all over again. This was a huge setback. But if that wasn't bad enough, Michelangelo had to endure regular delays. Every time the chapel was needed for a mass, he had to down his brushes and wait silently. At St. Joseph's, Leo and Fleur are facing the same frustrations. After just 3 days, painting the ceiling is taking its toll on Leo.
Well, everything was going well with this ceiling. And then came Saturday night, and Saturday night I just couldn't sleep because of the pain. And I thought, I've had enough of this. I found myself in hospital, and I've done something to a muscle at the back of the neck. No pain, no gain.
Painting the ceiling was hell for Michelangelo. It inspired him to write a poem, possibly one of the greatest odes to agony ever written.
I've already ruptured myself from all this strain. Just like it pisses down on cats in Lombardy. My beard points towards heaven. I feel the back of my brain upon my neck. My chest is like a harpy's. My hips have entered my belly, making a counterweight of my arse. And without my eyes, I move in vain.
If you show me how you're working for most of the day.
Well, most of it is stretching up like that. I mean, not absolutely at full-length arm, but sort of like that sort of height.
The pain is too much for Leo. Osteopath Karen Eastwood has been called in.
Okay, so you're doing this for how many hours a day?
Varies between about 8 and about 13 we've been doing.
And how long did Michelangelo do it for?
4 years.
And this is for you after a week?
Yeah, what a wimp, what a wimp.
So, if you imagine you're in this position all day, there are lots of blood vessels and nerve supply into the back of the head.
Yeah.
So you're compressing all those structures, so you would expect to have headaches possibly by the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah.
Tightness through the shoulders.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're working through here. With Michelangelo, he probably would have ended up with structural changes to his neck, maybe even more bony formation.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, his body changed as he's doing it?
Yeah, after 4 years.
Extraordinary.
As if the pain was not enough, Michelangelo also had to contend with the impatience of Julius II.
The Pope demanded that I dismantle the scaffolding so that he could see the work. I was furious. He was so keen that he arrived before even the dust had settled. The ceiling was only half finished, but the Pope stood in awe.
The Pope may have been impressed, but Michelangelo, after 2 years' hard labor, was in fact shocked by what he saw. When he looked up from 20 meters below, he found that the figures in the flood were too small to see. Working so close to the ceiling, he had misjudged the scale. Michelangelo now feared that his old adversary Bramante would use this mistake to persuade the Pope to replace him with his protege, Raphael.
Bramante, always Bramante, tried to persuade the Pope to let him take over. But I finally persuaded the Pope of Bramante's deficiencies as an architect, and Raphael never got near the ceiling.
When Michelangelo began work on the second half of the ceiling, he was determined not to make the same mistake again. He was about to show his true genius as a painter.
That's one of the things about Michelangelo, is his foreshortening and his use of his perspective tricks to move things through space and make them believable. I quite like the way he's done that arm, actually. It really is convincingly foreshortened. The way he's done it and sort of darkened off the bicep and not painted the forearm, it's quite a neat trick. Of course, he's painting like a sculptor, and he was.
See you in the morning. I can hear the whispers drifting up from down there. I can hear them saying, oh, he's just a simple sculptor. He's not capable of foreshortening. Not like the great Raphael. His fancy clothes and his fancy women. Well, just look up there. Look at God creating the grass and the plants. Wherever you go, he follows you. From down there, it'll look like magic.
Everything was going well with the painting, but there was yet another delay. This time, it was a row about money.
He went to get his money, but the Pope was no longer there. The Pope was in Bologna fighting a war. What does he do? He goes to Bologna to ask the Pope for the money that is due to him. Having succeeded, apparently, in telling the Pope that he needed his money, he went back to Rome. The money did not arrive. He went to Bologna a second time before the money finally arrived.
After 8 months, the Pope returned from the war. The first thing he wanted to see was his ceiling, but Michelangelo wouldn't let him anywhere near it.
The Pope just tried to climb up here. So I blocked him by sitting on this ladder. The other day I ended up throwing planks at him. He shouted up at me, "When are you going to finish that ceiling? You've been up there for months. What are you playing at?" So I replied, quite reasonably in my opinion, "I'll finish that ceiling when I can." When I can.
By 1511, after 3 years' work, Michelangelo could just about see the light at the end of the tunnel.
You know, I think I've worked harder than anyone who has ever lived. I'm completely exhausted. But it's almost finished. And I'll be home in Florence before All Saints, if I don't drop dead in the meantime.
It's the final day for Leo and Fleur. They are finishing with minutes to spare.
Hey, Leo, we can't drag this out much longer.
That's going to have to do.
Come on, that's it.
That's it, yeah.
Well, one could go back and have another go.
No. You could fiddle and fiddle and fiddle. Job done.
Job done. Well done, Leo.
Well done, Fleur.
Leo and Fleur have met their deadline, but is their fresco a success? This will be determined by the congregation. It's the big day. The fresco is being unveiled at a special mass by Father Chris Cutler.
Today I am very pleased to be able to present to you a fresco by Michelangelo of the creation of Adam.
I'm absolutely flabbergasted. I think it's beautiful. And as the proud mother, of course, I'm very pleased with it.
It's really nice.
It's a very beautiful
It's a very good thing. Me as a parishioner, I'm happy.
It shows the connection of human and God, so I'm privileged for it being in my church.
After all the turmoil and hard work, the final result is absolutely wonderful. We're seeing the purity of the creation by God of us as human beings.
Fleur and Leo painted one scene, covering 12 square meters. Michelangelo painted 9 main scenes, and in total covered more than 500 square meters. He finally unveiled the ceiling to the Pope on the 31st of October, 1512. The Pope proved a hard man to please.
At first, the Pope said he was pleased, said he liked it. Then he changed his mind, said he wanted changes, more ultramarine, more flecks of gold. It looks poor without gold, he said. So I said to him, the people depicted in this painting, they are poor too, struggling, suffering, but you wouldn't know about that, would you? I'm not going to change it. Not a single detail. If he doesn't know perfection when he sees it. And now, after all my struggling and suffering, there's not the sign of a single ducat he owes me as a bonus.
But history would judge the ceiling differently. It was to become one of the world's greatest treasures. Fleur and Leo have come to the Vatican to see the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Fleur has seen it before, but this is the first time for Leo.
Oh dear. I can't believe this. I just want to...
What have we done?
I just want to reach out and touch it.
Tremble in wonder.
Yes, I've seen this 1,000 times in books, and there's no book will ever do justice to it. The quality of the tones and the colours, the quantity is absolutely staggering. Michaelangelo, my old son, you're one hell of a hard act to follow, a very hard act to follow. As one artist to another, I have to say, do take some beating.
Michelangelo was only 37. He had created a vision of heaven on earth, yet he still yearned for more. He would one day return to the Sistine Chapel to conclude the biblical story with a final, extraordinary painting. Within months of the ceiling being completed, Pope Julius II died. It was the end of an era. Michelangelo had lost his greatest critic and his greatest patron. But he could, at last, resume work on the Pope's tomb, a job which had been postponed 8 years earlier.
So once again, I embarked on the tragedy of the tomb. And it worked out just as unhappily as before. Worse, in fact. More difficulties, more disappointments, more anxieties. because of the malice of certain men. It brought disgrace, which will follow me to my grave.
But in 1513, Michelangelo approached the tomb with vigor. He had big ambitions for the colossal monument covered with statues.
He comes back to Florence and he begins working on 4 or more statues simultaneously, and this was common for Michelangelo, never to do one and finish one work, but to constantly work simultaneously on many of them. And we begin to see the sense of his energy and almost fury in attacking the marble as he once again has the opportunity to become a sculptor. One can see the chunks of marble coming off of this as he creates one of these slaves or captives intended to garland the lower story of the Julius tomb, one of 40 original figures.
Michelangelo would never finish the slaves. He completed just one statue, the Moses. Time and again he was distracted. The heirs of Julius II were becoming increasingly impatient with him, but the tomb saga would rumble on for another 30 years. In the end, the Pope's heirs had to settle for a much more modest tomb, with the Moses as its centerpiece.
One of the tragedies of Michelangelo's life was the fact he never completed the tomb, and we're left with that appalling mess.
To go from the more than 40 colossal statues originally planned to this wall tomb with one great statue and then a number of other figures carved to Michelangelo's design by his assistant was an amazing humiliation.
Julius's heirs wanted to know why they had received so little for their money.
I was not paid 16,000 ducats for the tomb. I was perfectly happy to fulfill my obligation, but Julius cancelled the commission. I did finish the amended commission when it was finally renewed, for which I received a mere 3,000 ducats, which was recorded in a certificate drawn up by a notary. Please write this. I will not be remembered as little better than a thief.
The records show beyond a shadow of doubt that Michelangelo received 12,000 ducats for the tomb project. At least 9,000 of that was profit.
That's more than £500,000 in today's money. The reason Michelangelo lost interest in the tomb was that he received a more lucrative and prestigious offer. It was a commission which he believed would bring him immortality, and it reunited him with his first great patrons, the Medici family. The new Pope, Leo X, was a Medici. He had known Michelangelo when they were growing up together in the Medici Palace 25 years earlier. Now Leo saw a new role for Michelangelo as an architect. He asked him to build an imposing facade for the Medici Church of San Lorenzo in the heart of Florence.
It's truly one of the most ambitious projects of all time. The final price agreed on for the facade was 40,000 ducats.
This was his most ambitious, his most expensive project ever. It was a facade entirely built out of white Carrara marble. In order to carry out the commission, Michelangelo spent nearly 3 years in the marble quarries and supervised teams of workers and brought out hundreds of blocks. And in the process developed rather close relationships with a number of his workers, many of whom we know from wonderful nicknames: the Cat, the Carrot, Oddball and Stumpy, Lefty, Nero and the Priest, and my favorite, the Antichrist. And many of these people remained with Michelangelo for years and years, and so we can throw out one of the most obvious myths about Michelangelo, that he always worked alone. In fact, he was an artist who was also an entrepreneur.
Then, out of the blue, in 1520, the commission was cancelled.
After 3 years of toil, I offered them something which would have been, with God's help, the finest work ever created. And now they say they've run out of money. I'm going to send them a bill for my time, a bill for the insult to my genius, and a bill for stealing from the world its greatest masterpiece.
The Medici appeased Michelangelo with a smaller commission, a church library for San Lorenzo. It may not have been on the same scale as the facade, but the Laurentian library would herald Michelangelo's arrival as a revolutionary architect. He created a building, the like of which had never been seen before. Michelangelo reinvented classical architecture and created his own brilliant and distinctive style. He designed every last detail, from the floor to the desks. But as he worked, Michelangelo was caught up in a war which would test his loyalties to the extreme. For years, the Medici family had vied for power in Florence against the Republican government. When the Medici were overthrown in 1527, Michelangelo took the side of the Republic. This was a mistake which would threaten his life. When the Medici returned to power, they were determined to avenge his treachery. 30 years ago, a remarkable discovery was made at San Lorenzo, which sheds light on this dark episode in Michelangelo's life. A security guard discovered a hidden door leading to a long-lost room. Inside, the walls were covered with drawings, but this was no ordinary graffiti.
It's a fascinating series of drawings, many of which relate to Michelangelo's work. And when they were first discovered, many people were certain they were by Michelangelo. And down the wall here, a figure from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, Eve. So many people believe this was the place where he hid for 3 months after the fall of the Republic.
I've heard rumors that a man has been hired to assassinate me. This morning, I was coming out of the San Niccolo gate, and suddenly there's this figure here whispering in my ear that if I don't get out of town immediately, my life is in serious danger. And just as suddenly, he's gone. Now, I don't know if this was God, the devil, but I'm leaving.
Michelangelo returned only when the Medici Pope, Clement VII, guaranteed his safety in return for his resuming work on a family mausoleum at San Lorenzo.
Here in the Medici Chapel, for the first time, Michelangelo realizes a lifelong ambition to combine architecture and sculpture. But Michelangelo has broken every single rule in the book, and he has, in a sense, liberated architecture from this point onward. People begin to invent and do things with architecture. Notice how the doors are so much smaller than the tabernacles over top. The whole architecture seems to be stretched upwards, so that up at the very top we have windows that even seem to taper towards the light. For after all, we're meant to be feeling as if we were in the realm of the dead, and we will resurrect our bodies to the realm of light. In the architecture of death that Michelangelo has created, of course, it's the famous statues that everybody pays attention to, the 2 ducal tombs of Lorenzo and Giuliano behind me, with the 4 famous figures of the times of day.
I portrayed night as a woman, and put an owl, the bird of night, at her feet. I even left a small piece of marble to carves a mouse. If only I'd had a chance to finish it. Such a pertinent symbol, the mouse. Forever gnawing. Like time. Devours everything.
Before the Medici tombs could be finished, Michelangelo suddenly left for Rome, never to return to Florence.
One's first impression of The Last Judgment is just the confrontation of hundreds and hundreds of figures, but I think it's an extremely subtle and sophisticated organization, utilizing what is standard, the layering of the souls and the movement down on one side of the damned and the rising of the resurrected. All of his contemporaries recognize The Last Judgment to be one of the final statements of Michelangelo's art and of Catholic theology.
The Sistine Chapel was now complete. From the creation to the apocalypse, Michelangelo had depicted the greatest story ever told, at the very heart of Christendom. By now, he was in his 70s. His health was failing, but the reigning Pope, Paul III, had one last challenge for him. It was nothing less than building the new Rome, a city that would surpass the glories of its classical past.
Here we see the principles of architecture at work. Order, proportion, design, and style. Rome will be the better for it.
Yes, Rome certainly was better off. In a sense, Michelangelo introduced cutting-edge, pioneering classical architecture to the city, an architecture which evoked the power, the memory of ancient Rome. Take the Campidoglio, for example. This was the political heart of Rome at the time, the hub of power. And here he created the city's first formal Renaissance piazza, quite incredible. And then the Porta Pia, this great gated design. And then there's the Palazzo Farnese, completed by Michelangelo for his patron and friend, Pope Paul III. And of course, this is a fantastic building because it establishes a prototype for the kind of contemporary Renaissance palazzo.
But there was one building above all, which would satisfy his lifelong quest to create something truly divine. A work which would guarantee his place in posterity on this earth, and in heaven too. Michelangelo was asked to take over the design of St. Peter's, the spiritual home of the Roman Catholic Church.
I wanted to be seen as independent and incorruptible. I wanted an outward sign to myself and others of my inner resolve to move closer to faith and the love of God. I vowed to myself that I would refuse all payment.
Most of the time that Michelangelo was working on St. Peter's, he was on his regular salary. So in fact, he was receiving about 1,000 ducats a year, and that made him one of the highest paid architects that St. Peter's ever had.
St. Peter's crowning glory would be a dome on a scale not seen in Rome since the Pantheon was built, more than 1,000 years before.
Building a dome was one of the great engineering challenges because by its nature it wants to fall down. And here you see an early sketch by Michelangelo for St. Peter's. The dome is formed by a series of stone ribs, and these are restrained by the great drum here, and the outward thrust essentially wants to spread itself out. So what Michelangelo does here is to have these great buttresses. You see there's a pair of columns, and these occur around the drum below the rib. So that is a system he used, a very advanced system of engineered construction, quite fascinating.
The dome would take many years to build, and time was running out for Michelangelo. In his final years, he wanted to ensure his family would achieve the aristocratic status he had always craved. His hopes rested on his nephew, Leonardo.
My dear Leonardo, choose a wife who is noble and poor. not to ennoble yourself, because it is known we are ancient citizens of Florence, but to have a companion worthy to bear our name.
He was delighted when Leonardo married into one of Florence's oldest families. At last, he had a worthy heir. Michelangelo was now preparing for the end, and how he would be remembered by history. He began to destroy drawings and poems he didn't think were good enough. He even attacked one of his last works of sculpture, the Florentine Pietà, which was intended for his own tomb. It's his most personal and moving work. Michelangelo himself is supporting the dead Christ, the divine artist and the Savior, united for eternity.
Tell me that I was not greedy, that I was never jealous of others, but praised them. Even Raphael, Leonardo, and that in all my works I was devoted only to the greater glory and love and beauty of your divine creation, O Lord. Have mercy on my soul.
Michelangelo died on the 18th of February, 1564. He was almost 89.
Mere mortal once, divine though born to be. Short time on earth, but heaven's forever mine. Rapturous change, when even death's benign. Deadly to many, but new life to me.
The divine Michelangelo left a worldly fortune. 8,000 gold ducats, numerous bank accounts, and landed estates in Tuscany. By today's standards, he was a millionaire several times over, and the richest artist the world had ever known. His nephew Leonardo inherited everything. Michelangelo's final legacy to the world was completed 30 years after his death, the Great Dome of St. Peter's. By designing the most important building in Christendom, Michelangelo achieved the divine status he always sought. He was God's sculptor, God's painter, and now God's architect. From the Dome to the David, from the Pietà to the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo had created a unique vision of heaven on earth.